get ready. I'm gonna start by introducing Andrew Selee. He's the president of Migration Policy Institute. Migration Policy Institute is one of the leading think tanks related to immigration issues, both advises governments around the world about immigration policy issues, but also conducts very serious research about immigration, immigrant adaptation in the US and globally. Andrew holds a PhD in policy studies from the University of Maryland and a master's in Latin American studies from the University of California, San Diego. His research focused on migration globally, with emphasis on immigration to the US and especially from Latin America and the Caribbean. But as you see, he's also doing research on policy issues about migration in Latin America. He has published several books, including Vanishing Frontiers, The Forces Driving Mexico and the United States Together. It would be interesting to them to revisit.
Oh, I keep thinking I should rewrite that.
You should revisit. And what should think tanks do? Strategic guide to policy impact. So he has that policy vision that sometimes we lack in just pure academic work. And he has published opinion pieces. He also teaches at Georgetown University, was just telling me he teaches a class with Catherine Donata, which is a good friend of ours. And so without further ado, let me introduce to you Andrew Selee.
Famous last words, everything nice. Academic world. Hello, everybody. How are you? Can you hear me, by the way? Can you hear me? Is this good? Okay. Great to be with you. Before I dive in, first of all, I'm happy to talk about all sorts of things when we get to Q&A. And hola, Gabriela, ¿cómo estás? Gusto verte. My good friend back there. Oh, hello there. So happy to talk about what's going on, say, with the Trump administration when you want. Happy to talk about think tanks in general and policy research. We can talk about any of that and all of the above. I just got back from Europe. Happy to talk about migration in Europe. But I'm going to actually talk about migration policies in Latin America and the Caribbean today, which is slightly refreshing because I have to say we spend a lot of our time right now trying to figure out what the hell is going on in this country. And I'm glad not to be talking about that today. But I am happy to talk about it if anyone wants to. How many people here follow Latin America and the Caribbean or specialize in it? I mean, is there? Okay, so some do, some don't. How many do migration? Okay, yeah, so some overlap also there. Okay, let me talk about, what I called here an emerging architecture. I later call it architectures because I think that may be more accurate. Or maybe an architect with multiple personalities. I'm not sure which, but it is, there really are multiple architectural migration policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm basing it on a book that I'm doing with three colleagues of mine, Valerie Lecarte, Diego Chavez Gonzalez, and Ariel Ruiz Soto. We are all colleagues at Migration Policy Institute. We've been working on migration policies in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so we pulled together a lot of things we did and pitched it to Stanford University Press. And we now have a book coming out in August, which is wonderful. And what books do for those who have written books, is sort of it forces you to take things you've worked on already and try and look at the big picture, right? We've done lots of specific reports and op-eds and all sorts of things, specific research pieces, but sort of forces us to try and pull this together and see if we can find some common patterns across the hemisphere. Much of the literature on migration is a literature based on, for those that study migration, you will know is based on policies in the United States and Canada, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, right? Overwhelmingly dominated. There are some voices like Dr. Amigo Parado, who has focused on trying to bring forth policies and demography of migration within other parts of the world, right? There definitely is, and there's a large emerging literature now on this. A lot of it is coming to fruition right now of people who've been studying, most migration takes place within reasonable distance of where people live, right? That migration, the longer distance migration to wealthier countries is not the dominant pattern of migration around the world. So increasingly there is a literature emerging, which is also the result of, for example, funding shifting over time, right? Some of these are about migration policies and migration patterns in other parts of the world. We wanted to contribute to that. We actually got into this for policy reasons, I have to say, because we're semi-academics. I would say pseudo-academics, that's probably too much. We're semi-academics. We're academically informed, but we really do policy-focused work. And so we have really gotten pulled into thinking about policies in Latin America as a result of the Venezuelan displacement crisis. And so we had done some work on that. That had gotten us to pull together a number of governments, actually, where we started originally 4 governments, and then there were 6 later on. We kept adding them in, where we started doing horizontal learning on how you think of migration, building migration policies. We had, it was originally Mexico, Costa Rica, Mexico dealing with lots of Central Americans, Costa Rica with Nicaraguans, Colombia and Peru, and then we added Ecuador and Chile, large flows of Venezuelans, in the case of Chile, also Haitians. And sort of how do you think about migration policies, right? And are there ways of doing it differently than maybe it's done in Europe or the United States, which we were kind of curious about. I mean, that for us was a learning experience. And I would say part of what we learned, and this is sort of where the book, and then we started doing lots of research on this, part of what I want to point is that in some ways, some of what we know about migration policy looks different in different parts of the world, right? It looks slightly different. Now there's some continuities, right? We also shouldn't assume that the same pressures that policymakers face are completely different in Brazil than they are in the United States. There are some continuities, but there are also choices that are made along the way, right? And there are different pressure points that have to do with different contexts. So, okay. First of all, there's a long history of migration in the Americas. If I didn't say this, Dr. Barello would, jump on me, so I'll make sure to say this here, since he's one. I mean, I have to say he's one of the 3 or 4 foundational researchers on migration in the Americas. So let me, go back and just say, I mean, migration starts when the first people get here 18 to 20,000 years ago. There is a long and rich history of migration among native peoples in this country, what we call native peoples, although they, of course, originated somewhere else, as we all did, right? But there's a long, rich history, some of which we know. There's more and more that we know about that, and some of which we still don't know, actually, right? Conquest and colonialism certainly set up an accelerated process of migration, right? With both Europeans coming over, but also enslaved people from Africa. And this continued after the end of colonialism, although colonialism really went up through the 60s and really the 70s in the case of Belize, I mean, in this hemisphere as well. So colonialism is kind of in the book, I think I cut off all the footnotes and all these sort of added notes on here for the PowerPoint, but let me just say, we sort of say colonialism, we sort of said ends in around 1800 here. That is perfectly true some places and perfectly untrue other places, but for purposes of this was useful. But you can see it really, colonial period is a huge number. By the way, most slaves came to the Americas, the United States, right? Came to Latin America and the Caribbean. And then hugely accelerated, after in the 1800s through the First World War. Wrong device here, let's see. And now it's released, there we go. Okay, the 20th century, there was an enormous amount of migration. The large narrative, there was actually a fair amount of, by the way, I should go back here and say there was also some intra-regional migration. The dominant narrative was migration from Europe, Africa, later the Middle East and Asia. But there was intra-regional migration as well. I mean, the largest or most visible were people from the Caribbean islands who moved to Central America, Venezuela, Colombia, sort of the Caribbean, the outer rims of the Caribbean basin in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But there was always lots of intra-regional migration. Same is true in the 20th century. There is a period of low mobility from the First World War to the Second World War. But the dominant narrative in the 20th century, and the dominant pattern, is of people leaving Latin American and Caribbean countries, initially for colonial powers, but also for the United States and Canada. And of course, this starts earlier. In the case of Mexicans, it starts in the late 1800s, right? I mean, a few Central Americans, I mean, certainly the big Mexican pattern started in the late 1800s. So again, this is sort of skipping over a bit of nuance. But just to say, there was lots and lots of migration. And if you walk down the streets in Mexico or Colombia and said, I want to talk to you about migration, people's initial response, even 10 years ago, by the way, people's initial response would have been, oh, I've got a cousin who lives in Chicago, or I know someone who lives in Madrid, or, I've got, if you're Haiti, someone, I know sort of Guadeloupe, I know someone who lives in, Paris, right? There was migration, when you said migration, yeah, even 5 years ago, frankly, I mean, in many places, when you said migration, and still today, if you say migration on the street in Mexico, most people think about their cousin in Chicago. They're not thinking about, they might also say, and we had a caravan that came through here. But migration still is very much dominated by the fact that there were large numbers of people who left. Now, there were also large numbers of people who moved within Latin America. It tended to be to neighboring countries. There tend to be well-established patterns, often from poor countries to wealthier countries, but there were also lots of border mobility going on. And Venezuela, and there were certain countries, Venezuela and Argentina are the two big ones, right? That were the draw. It has some of the best articles, by the way, which we teach, Dr. Donato. I teach every fall, by the way. Yes, well, students enjoy it. But there was, Venezuela and Argentina are the two big draws, but also Trinidad, when gas and oil took off, became a huge draw for Guyanese and Haitians and others. Within Central America, Costa Rica was always a draw for Nicaraguans, Mexico for other Central Americans. So there were countries that had, but again, we're talking, if you look at numbers back in 2010, what you would see is that Latin America and the Caribbean have the lowest immigrant stock of any region. Right? I mean, in every other part of the world, people move a lot more within the region. More people came in from the outside than Latin America and the Caribbean. It was kind of that weird outlier. The Americas are outliers on many things, by the way. For those of you that are American or Latin American or from the Caribbean, most of the world is really connected to each other. We kind of are out in the middle of nowhere. Okay, we're disconnected. I mean, it is just sort of worth remembering. I get hit by this periodically all the time. The rest of the world is physically connected, right? People have moved for centuries. People have fought wars across common shared borders for centuries. We've kind of been hanging out there, right? Once in a while, we kind of get pulled into a world war. There are certainly internal conflicts. But just remember, the Western Hemisphere is kind of an unusual place that is much more disconnected. It was the last place on Earth populated, right, as well, right? I mean, 18 to 20,000 years ago sounds like a long time, but actually in the course of human history, it's the last place on Earth that gets populated, right, for the same reasons. Okay, so lots of migration. As you can see, North America eventually takes, the US is by far and away the dominant place. But Europe is also really significant, and Spain, obviously for linguistic reasons with Latin America, stands first among others. Migration policies existed back then. They were not particularly at top of the mind. Like if you interviewed a president or prime minister of a Latin American Caribbean country 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they would have acknowledged policies on migration, but it would not have been one of the top things that they got elected on. It probably would never have mentioned in the campaign. They might pause for a minute if you asked them to talk about migration policy and dug down and remembered their last conversation about the diaspora or some specific immigration issue. But it was not, generally speaking, a high-level policy area. But there were migration policies, and they were shaped by different things. So they're not very politically set, generally underdeveloped. Some countries developed immigration laws, generally fairly what we would call liberal immigration laws, because fairly open, in large part because they were trying to mimic there was very little immigration to most countries. And to the extent it existed, they were trying to mimic what they wished other countries would do with their own nationals. Mexico stands out on this 2011 immigration law. I've spent a lot of time trying to the guy who's sort of the main writer of this. They were trying to show the US how the US should treat their people as much as, because there weren't that many people going to Mexico. It was kind of an easy give, right? So, but true in other countries as well. This was, migration was primarily about dealing with your diaspora. So migration policy was not so much about hard issues in your country that you had to go back and justify to your electorate. It was primarily around modeling with people you were negotiating with in other countries. Democratization also played a role in this. Human rights played a role in this. The notion that countries were building also democratic states after periods of authoritarianism, or in the Caribbean becoming independent states. There were also a lot of, since this was not a major political issue, a lot of sort of signaling the kind of things that a country should signal on this, but it had not yet become part of politics. And then finally, I mean, this is very important. We will come back to this again and again, actually. There were sub-regional agreements that were set among several regions of the world. And in fact, America and the Caribbean stand out for this. I mean, this exists to some extent in Africa. It certainly exists in Europe, right? Has anyone flown around Europe recently? It's kind of fun, right? It's like a domestic flight as long as you're within Schengen, I mean, that's really a mobility agreement, right? That's pretty sophisticated. There's some attempt to do this in Africa. There's some attempt to do this in other parts of the world, in Central Asia with Russia. But Latin America and the Caribbean actually have 5 agreements of different subregions that have tried to create agreements on mobility, allow people to move much easier. Some are much broader. Mercosur, for example, is probably the broadest, which really allows people to move and live in other countries. Really only fully observed by 2 of the countries in Mercosur. This is the southern part of the southern continent, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay. Chile and Bolivia are actually joined this one as well. The Caribbean has a much more limited one, which really allows professionals to move and allows other people to move, to enter visa free, but have to leave after 6 months. The Eastern Caribbean actually allows people to move completely, which turns out to really matter because of hurricanes, believe it or not. We actually discovered this along with my colleague Beto de Carta was looking at the Caribbean. That was, we were actually fascinated how many people have used the Eastern Caribbean Mobility Agreement when there are hurricanes, and this allows them, because there's also so much intermarriage among countries, the fact that you don't have to ask for a visa, you can go and start working in another country on day 1, means that people can go start their lives over and then eventually return to where they started from. It's really interesting. Central America, much more limited, and the Andean region had one that really didn't start getting active until about 3 years ago. And wrong instrument. Oh, here we go. Here is the key chart that you should see today. And I know there's anyone here doing demography, a demographer or studying demography. I am not. So if I were a demographer, you would see a better chart than this, but none of us are demographers. So this is what you got, okay? But you can see the enormous growth, right? In the number, and the real jump is 2015 to 2022. That is a huge growth. It starts to slow down a little bit after. If you did 2015 to 2020, it would be pretty big. There's still a growth actually during COVID, interestingly enough. And it actually does start to level off a bit. It's an almost doubling.
Stocks.
Stocks. Yeah, this is stock. This is migrant stock in Latin American Caribbean countries. Almost doubles in a period of 12 years. So, which is still, by the way, lowest among regions, depending how you define regions of the world, but how IOM would, still the lowest migrant stock as a percentage of the population, but the fastest growth over the last 15 years. Uneven growth across different countries. Some countries don't grow at all. Some countries grow very quickly. Costa Rica was always a country of immigration. It grew a little bit. Colombia, however, had less than 1% of its population born abroad. Now it's about 6%.
Is that driven by Venezuela?
Colombia is entirely Venezuelans. However, and this, well, let me say Venezuelans are a huge part of this, right? I mean, Venezuelans are about 70% of the change. And you can see large numbers come in Peru, particularly, but also Ecuador, Brazil, Chile, and then pretty much everywhere. There's no country other than, Haiti that probably does not have a large Venezuelan community. Even countries, I was surprised in Honduras to find a large, it's large, but a few thousand Venezuelans would move there for people who had ties there for some sort of reason. If you add in Haitians and Nicaraguans, which are 2 other displacement crises after the earthquake in Haiti, and then sort of how do you even add up sort of crises in Haiti here? It's sort of nonstop crises. Lots of people have left. You add up Nicaraguans who primarily go to Costa Rica. You actually get to about 75. You explain about 75% of the growth. But 75% is a lot, but it's not all. It's still another 25% that's for other reasons there. And one of the things, no, somewhere I thought I had a slide that says this, maybe I do somewhere further along, is that, oh yeah, here it is. Venezuelans are, so it's a huge difference, but Venezuelans are actually only the majority of immigrants in 3 countries, and that's Colombia, Peru, and just narrowly in Ecuador. Now, they're really visible. They're often the recent migrant flow in other countries, but if you go to Chile, I mean, they're only about 35%, I can't remember the latest number, of immigrants in Chile. There's a lot of Peruvians, there's a lot of Bolivians, there's actually a fair number of Argentines, right? I mean, in the border region, people move back and forth a lot, and they tend to be more middle class, and lots of Haitians. So, I mean, Chile is quite diverse. Ecuador is quite diversified. Ecuador was, last we checked, about 57, 58% of the immigrants were Venezuelans, which is still a majority, but it means you got another 43% from other places in the world. So this is, a lot of the change is a story of Venezuela and plus, Nicaragua, plus Haiti, but not all of it, right? And that's sort of an interesting part of this. So displacement, we could spend lots and lots of time on this, but I will jump through things way too fast here. It's just to say that in terms of displacement, countries in Latin America and the Caribbean were fairly good about providing legal status. Almost none of them use the asylum system other than Brazil, and at the margins, Costa Rica and Mexico. Although we were surprised to find out that most Venezuelans, even though Mexico made a big deal about giving Venezuelans, and as did Costa Rica about giving Venezuelans asylum, most Venezuelans did not go to the asylum system. They actually went through regular visas. We were completely surprised by that, actually. My colleague Luciana Gandini from in Mexico and I were trying to figure this out. And, really only Brazil used the asylum system extensively. This is sort of a result, I'll come back to this towards the end, but partially a result of the fact that very weak institutions, but also lots of discretion, as a result of that, lots of discretion for the executive branch. And so one of my favorite meetings was with the then head of the borders of Colombia. At the time, they were first doing a temporary protection program. And I had said, what is this temporary protection status that you gave to Venezuelans? He leans back in his chair and then just starts laughing. And he says, I have absolutely no idea. He said, it is something we created because we could. He's like, we had no ability to do asylum. It's controlled. This is not for totally public. The foreign ministry is not really on board with this. They control the asylum system. Also, we just no capacity to asylum right now. We have to go to Congress if we wanted to get resources. The president we came up with a figure that the president could create that would allow people to stay in the country that passes legal muster. But we don't really know what it is. It's not a visa. It's not it's not a residency permit. It is not something that ever existed before. A lot of countries created temporary pathways. Really good in some ways and really bad in others, right? Really good in that it's fast to do. You can do it in mass numbers. Bad in that it is temporary and it's hard to figure out what it transitions into. But countries did this. Some countries use their visa systems. Some countries, Argentina, Uruguay, mostly use their regional mobility agreements, which we'll keep coming back to, but a lot created temporary programs. Most countries gave access to education, which was, other than Trinidad and Tobago, which was actually quite significant, by the way. There's some hangups here and there, but generally speaking, lots of access. Some to healthcare. Most gave healthcare to pregnant women and children under a certain age. Some actually, like Ecuador and Chile, give healthcare to almost everyone. And Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay. Mix of measures vary by country, but also by the nationality of immigrants. Not all immigrants are treated equally. We'll come back to that, for example. Do not assume that being displaced, that this is a general predisposition to helping all displaced people. It also had a great deal to do with specific choices around which nationalities to support. Now, generally speaking, the people that came to most countries were able to access it, but Haitians in the Dominican Republic cannot, for example, right? I mean, are not treated as displaced population. Haitians, in fact, in most of the Caribbean are not, right? Whereas Venezuelans in Dominican Republic are treated as displaced population. But also over time, greater border control. Also, a lot of the same reflexes began to set in that we see elsewhere in the world, where at the beginning, huge open borders for displaced populations, but then the beginnings of visa requirements and controls. This is not the only part, again, because displacement is not the only issue. Remember the other 25% out there, right? There has been a deepening of regional mobility agreements. We keep expecting this to go away, but it doesn't actually. The CARICOM is in the middle of negotiating a much deeper agreement. The Andean community finally launched its mobility, it's the ability for people to live in other countries 3 years ago. I mean, there's actually stuff still going on in terms of nearby countries having more access to move and to live in neighboring countries and within subregions. More institutional investment in migration agencies, and that's both in control as well as in facilitation. I mean, for the first time, you have migration agencies that can make policy decisions about who should get visas, for example, and have real personnel who are specialized in, some countries, Argentina already had that, Brazil did as well. But some countries, it was kind of like if you end up at the migration agency, that's kind of like, you don't want to stay there forever. That's not a career path, right? You want to you're gonna get to another real agency. Now you're starting to get career paths in these agencies. But also we should assume for control, it's not just the facilitation side, you're getting professionalization on both sides. You get updated migration frameworks, sometimes laws, sometimes rulemaking, some attempts to attract talent. There's beginning of a conversation in some countries. Costa Rica has a remote worker visa right now. Chile and Brazil have gone out and tried to figure out how to get professionals in certain areas where they want to attract it. You know, we have some of that going on, and lots of efforts to maintain relationships with the diaspora, because don't forget, politically, for many countries, diasporas matter. Why do diasporas matter, by the way? Does anyone want to venture a guess? Money, yeah, money. Money is a big part of it, right? Money and also political influence sometimes, investment, I mean, all those things, right? They're significant players. And a number of countries, for example, allow their diaspora to vote. My favorite, by the way, connection here on this, sorry, another random anecdote, but at one point, for actually 5 years, during the arrival of the largest number of Venezuelans, the chair of the critical committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, which makes decisions on migration in Ecuador, was an Ecuadorian elected by Ecuadorians abroad. He was one of the 6 people in the Congress, which was absolutely fascinating, because in the politics of Ecuador's decision to grant different legal statuses to Venezuelans, a guy who had spent most of his life living in Venezuela, whose son had grown up in Venezuela, who was his key advisor, who I got to know fairly well, were actually making decisions on this. And they were great because they were shuttling back and forth between the Venezuelan migrant groups and the government and trying to figure out things. It was really fast. They hear domestic and international politics sending all sorts of okay, so the new architectures for migration. We're headed towards the end here, people. Policy. Mobility agreements continue. That's actually, I think, significant hallmark of this region. The mobility agreements are around sub-regions where people feel some common shared history. They tend to be similar in economic weight. Haiti in CARICOM is the exception, but Haiti's also been excluded from the updated negotiations in CARICOM mobility, right? But these tend to be countries like the Andean countries or Mercosur. Although who's included expands, because as you remember, the idea of having Bolivia at some point as part of a mobility agreement would have seemed crazy, right? The underdeveloped, but Bolivia is now actually the place where, although they did it actually at the time, they did Bolivia. Paraguay is included actually. I mean, suddenly countries that were migrant sending countries are now seen as being much more equal partners in this. Significant openness to certain displaced migrants, although narrowing over time, particularly new arrivals, still some openness to people that have already gotten in. Concerns about new arrivals, not totally surprising, by the way, unending displacement crises that cause real problems. A surprising bet on legal status and access to labor markets and education, but limited government support. And with a couple of colleagues, we've kind of looked at this around the world, sort of the alternate version of what's generally done in the refugee regime around the world, where displaced people get lots of benefits, but very little access to labor markets. Latin America appeared to be the opposite. Actually got legal access to schools, got access to working, and almost no support. You know, not a bad deal, actually. I mean, really rough at the beginning for people, but if you want to be, your choice between being a Syrian in protracted displacement in Jordan where you can't work versus being a Venezuelan in protracted displacement in Peru where you get nothing, but you're allowed to work. You'd probably rather arrive as a Syrian, but you'd probably 2 years out rather be the Venezuelan, right? So there's something actually interesting here. Very active outreach to diasporas that continues, and growing efforts to control borders and begin to build some ability to know who comes in. On balance, migration policy is yet to be politicized in most countries. Huge exceptions, Dominican Republic. We talk about the Dominican. We actually we tried to problematize the Dominican Republic a bit in this book, which you can come back to if you want to, but I don't want to. Just know it's an outlier. We're starting to see a little bit in Chile, less in Peru, a little bit, but Peru's an outlier also. Peru, not so much really. In Chile, we are seeing some politicization, but generally speaking, migration policy has yet to become a major political issue in the way it is in the US or in Europe or even in Canada at the moment, or Australia. There is some general public discontent. If you ask people, you can say there is public discontent over mass migration, but it has yet to become salient, right? So if you look at public opinion polls, wow, people have sort of the same, frustrations about migrants in Colombia that they have in the United States, except that you will notice that there's no anti-immigrant party. There really aren't, that has yet to become politically activated because people have 16 other problems they're more worried about. Still degree of openness to some immigration, but also weak institutions that struggle to implement policy decisions. By the way, the real reason why only 65 to 70% of Venezuelans have gotten legal status is not that countries didn't want to. Some countries didn't want to, but the main reason is not that, is that the institutions have a really hard time actually doing what they're supposed to do. I mean, a lot of it is sort of great openness followed by sort of weak implementation. Anyone who works in Latin America, the Caribbean, you know what I'm talking about. Likely short-term futures, we're likely to see continued efforts to achieve greater sub-regional mobility. Efforts to integrate migrants that are already there, but iterative because, again, capacity is lacking. Greater control of borders, especially the closer you are to the United States. To that last slide. And I should say openness and closure are not opposites. I say this frequently. I mean, we tend to assume in our discourse that either you love all immigrants or you hate all immigrants, right? You're either for it or you're against it. In the real world, policy decisions almost always have a mixture of both, right? Even the most open policies also have questions of credibility, who comes in. Everyone comes in, we've chosen a certain displaced population, we want people who are more highly educated, but also we want a couple of people in these other sectors. Every country makes choices about this, right? So openness and closure almost always exist in tandem. Happy to talk more about that if anyone wants to. And a renewed focus on the diaspora, especially on returns at a time where countries are expecting to get a lot of their citizens sent back from the US. Okay, what explains policy response? This is the last slide here. One is, I think, we played with this a lot and we don't have an answer. By the way, if this were an academic paper, do not go to your dissertation committee. How many of you are PhD students, by the way? Okay, do not go to your dissertation committee and do what we do here and say, I've got 5 reasons that are totally disconnected and you can just choose which one you like here. But I'm gonna do it anyway, you guys, which is, recent experience with migration, primarily immigration, shaped policy. To some extent, it shaped individual sympathies with migration, at least early on, but more importantly, it shaped actual policies early on, right? It shaped constitutions and laws, because at the time when there was more immigration than immigration, governments had an investment in creating openness in immigration policy. It was about symbols, not about actual policy determination. But that policy is often path dependent, right? I mean, people come in and the law on the books allows them to do things like it is not illegal to be undocumented in Mexico. That actually is significant, right? It had been illegal, by the way, and then they changed that because they were trying to signal to the US what a real good policy would look like. That actually matters then for future policy decisions, right? You can kind of go down the line. Ecuador says in its constitution, people have a right to migrate. Now, the law doesn't actually fit with that, but the fact that the Constitution says that, and courts will sometimes come back to that, really matters, right? So number one is partially because of sympathy, but a lot of it is because of path dependency in policy. Second, symbolic construction of shared identity. This whole thing about sub-regional matters. And we've wrestled with this a lot. And I can't give you, anyone a psychologist here? It's a great social psychology question, but people create in-groups and out-groups. The fact that Colombians moved to Venezuela in large numbers at a time of crisis matters for Colombians taking in Venezuelans. They see them as part of the fact that Turkey, is a fellow Muslim country with Syria was important, at least initially. By the way, you can't live on these things forever. People get tired still, but it was important in early decisions, right? The fact that Ukrainians are seen as an extension of Europe, as sort of the edge of Europe, really matters for Europe receiving Ukrainians right now, right? These things matter in ways that we can't always calculate. Now, when you create in-groups, you create out-groups, right? So some groups get received better than others, right? We shouldn't assume that creating in-groups is necessarily a positive thing. Having just spent the week in Europe, Europeans love other Europeans moving around, but there's a huge movement to try and make sure there's an outside border, right? That everyone accepts what the terms are on that outside border, right? In-groups and out-groups. But there is a symbolic construction of identity around sub-regions where at least crises in those subregions have been able to be managed much more easier. Geopolitics definitely matters. If anyone's doing IR here, geopolitics really matters. I mean, some decisions were made, by the way, because people hated Maduro, the president of Venezuela, right? And so there was a way of signaling, or Costa Rica with the Nicaragua, showing that they were standing up against the Nicaraguan government without getting in too much trouble, because they never want to get into, they don't have an army, the Nicaraguans do. But there was, geopolitics matters. The US, the closer you are to the US, the more the US matters, right? The US has huge influence, say, on visa policy of countries in the region. At some point, the US has gotten to almost every country in the region to deal with visa requirements on one nationality or another that are coming in through that country and heading north. So geopolitics matters enormously for decisions that are being made. And certainly the hardening of borders is mostly a domestic political decision in most countries right now. But it is also certainly incentivized in countries that have a closer relationship to the United States, where the US has leverage, especially right now, but even under the Biden. Institutional capacity, which was something that both allowed experimentation. A lot of stuff might not have happened if you had to go to Congress and get legislation. The fact that migration was underdeveloped in some countries was really a good thing. I mean, at least it was a good thing for the displaced people. Now, not a good thing in the long term, right? You actually need institutions. So it allows experimentation, makes implementation really hard. But it was one of these areas where there was a lot of sort of horizontal learning in a space that had very little public engagement yet, and where executives could make decisions. And finally, inequality and crime. We're talking about highly unequal countries for the most part. Less so in Trinidad, less so in Uruguay, but mostly true in other countries. Inequality and migration mix in uneven ways. In some ways, it means that people have bigger concerns than, the Venezuelan or the Haitian that just moved in next door because you're all in the same boat. But in some ways, it also means that your underfunded school suddenly has 10 other kids in the classroom, that was already didn't have enough teachers, right? Or you suddenly have a housing crisis that was already there that's worse, or you walk into the emergency room, which you always have to wait for 2 hours, and this time you had to wait for 4 hours. And then you heard some people speaking with a foreign accent. Inequality plays out in different ways. Crime plays out in different ways. Crime is, in countries where crime has risen, where there's a perception of crime rising, Chile and Ecuador in particular, we see enormous tendency to put it on migrants, even if that doesn't happen to be the case. We've actually done some research on this. It does not happen to be the case. But we should assume, and for those that live in the United States, which I'm assuming is everyone here, at least you're here permanently or temporarily, you're seeing echoes of this in the US. It's not hard when people perceive a rise in crime, whether or not it's true, to then say, yes, because of these people. And you always find some of these people that are doing it, right? So, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's proportionally true, but you can always sort of make that case. So those are things that are hanging out. I still expect that you're going to see a different mix, a different architecture in Latin America and the Caribbean moving forward. I do not think the countries are largely becoming US-like. We have not seen a sort of Trump or a Marine Le Pen or an AFD type response on immigration in Latin America and the Caribbean, other than Dominican Republic, where we have seen it. But again, different history. But I do think you're going to see a little bit of tightening around borders and around visa policy, in large part because of the US, but also frankly because after a period of large-scale migration, there's a bit of not a sort of giant explosion, but a bit of a pushback, right? Public opinion is less positive. It's yet to be salient, but there's a rumbling that politicians are taking notes. Here's my email if you want to reach out. Can I handle a question? Okay.
So,
Do you mind identifying yourself, by the way, just so
Jerry Behrman, I'm an economist.
Okay, good. Are you here at Penn as well?
I'm here at Penn.
Okay, great.
My question is, as you look across Latin America and Caribbean countries, there's a lot of differences I perceive in the extent to which aging is dominating the populations. And my question is whether you see that, whether you see Chile behaving differently than, I don't know, Ecuador, in part because of the more rapidly aging population, therefore perhaps a greater perceived need for working age people and perhaps less overburdened basic school system, etc.
You know, it hasn't seen it for the most part yet, and partially I think because of the increase in migration obscured this in a country like Chile, right? And so the sense is we already got people. You do start to hear it. I mean, the place Uruguay actually under the last administration had I guess it was, I don't think it changed over yet. I can't remember. It may still be the current administration. I don't know.
The new one that the one that just won?
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know if
but
they took over.
Lacalle
Yeah,
was,
yeah,
he's probably still president, right? I don't know, they don't, but Lacalle actually created a task force in the presidency on migration where they were trying to attract professional workers. They wanted to choose who came because no one migrates to Uruguay. I'm exaggerating. Uruguay is actually one of the best countries to migrate to in terms of the legal framework. It's actually pretty, you know, if you're from South America, from anywhere in South America, it's a great country, but it's also an expensive country. It is a complicated country to figure out for all the right reasons. If you're Uruguayan, it's actually the one sort of welfare state in Latin America, but it's hard for foreigners to figure out.
Also because it's full of rich Argentinians.
It's full of rich Argentinians, yeah, and it's expensive. I mean, it's an expensive country to live in. And so they were trying to figure out how to attract people because they got the demographic issue. I've seen this in northern Mexico among business people, not among governments. Governments inherit it, but they don't really see it as a policy issue. But there's a number of businesses I've talked to in northern Mexico, the big businesses, that are having trouble recruiting workers because they're aging, right? And so they've realized that for frontline workers, they just can't get the workers they need. Now, you could get people from southern Mexico. I mean, there's actually also a different in population growth in different parts of Mexico. Mexico better than I do. Well, as a country, we probably both know the population, you know. But there's, you know, but that doesn't seem to work. And so they've actually embraced the arrival of Haitians in Central America as a way of getting people in the labor. And then Barbados is the other country that I've actually seen this in the Caribbean, where they're actually beginning to put out feelers and see who they can recruit. And they're even willing to recruit Haitians, actually, which has always been an issue in parts of the Caribbean, doing a strong discrimination against Haitian migrants. But they're sort of starting to realize that their demographic needs may override some of their natural resistance. So yeah, I mean, those are the places I've seen. But I think largely it's not getting the attention it should because, you know, a country like Colombia really has a demographic issue, but you just got, your population went from, you know, I think it's actually like 0.2 to 6% foreign born. And so that kind of took care of the issue for the time being, right? But it'll catch up. Yeah.
So you keep mentioning the Dominican Republic.
I do, yeah.
I have to put it out there. Obviously, here we're talking a lot about birthright citizenship. I was talking to a student who was writing an article for the Daily Pennsylvanian, the local paper, who asked me if birthright citizenship if there was an example anywhere of birthright citizenship being revoked, and if so, what happened? And I knew obviously the Dominican Republic example, but I didn't know the what happened
Yeah.
part. So can you just talk a little bit about the
Sure. So the Dominican Republic is the one place in Latin America and the Caribbean where identity has really been formed vis-a-vis another country. They share an island, right? For those that are not, that don't focus on the Western Hemisphere, share an island together. And there's a lot of history there, right? I mean, Haiti is formed as the result of a slave revolt. It controls Dominican Republic. Dominican Republic actually wins its independence from Haiti. So, right, in some ways, for Dominicans, it is sort of the colonial power, right? And there is develops over the time a really strong sense that Haitians are the others. And it is the one place where it is incredibly racialized as well, where the assumption is Haitians are the blacks. You can find people with the same skin color in the Dominican Republic, but they will talk about Haitians as being black and themselves not as being. Now, that's not true of everyone. You can find lots of Dominicans, I mean, lots of people in the scholarly community who don't, you know, who can criticize that. Don't get me wrong. But historically, that's been a benefit of the construction of identity, right? And even people, the longtime dictator of the Dominican Republic, who was himself partly Haitian, actually, you know, had a huge hand actually in creating this notion in the 20th century. I mean, it already existed back in the 19th century, but really sort of pushing it in that this was, two completely different societies. So Dominican Republic has always based its identity on not being Haitian, right? I mean, some people argue something is similar true between US and Mexico, for example, right? I mean, this, particularly, we are not the third world, we are not Latin America, we are not, those people there. We're a different country that, you get this in lots of places in the world, but it isn't true. I mean, we sort of look for we're trying to find any other country. You can find rivalries, right? I mean, between Chile and Argentina, Brazil, and there's lots of rivalries. There was a war fought, in Central America over a soccer game. I mean, there's lots of stuff, but the same sort of deep sort of identity politics are hard to define. So what happened in the Dominican Republic is that a Supreme Court decision said that that Haitians who came in illegally, you were not entitled to your children are not entitled. Well, the children of people who came in illegally are not entitled to citizenship. But what it actually did was not only denaturalize one generation, but actually two and sometimes three generations of people, because their parents then were no longer, or grandparents were no longer born in the Dominican Republic of Haitian immigrants who had legal status were no longer Dominicans. It's a huge issue. That is the one case I can think of. And by the way, in the Americas, the only two countries that I'm sure this is true that do not have birthright citizenship are the Dominican Republic since that decision, because they did have it, and Colombia. And Colombia is in the group of countries. This is very much of the Americas. The Americas, and we got to figure, right? These are settler societies, with the exception of the indigenous, the native populations, right? Which were, which were there first. But for the most part, as people, the states, colonial powers saw this as settler societies. And then as they became independent, countries wanted to be able to claim as their citizens people who had come from Europe, not the ones who came from Africa, the ones who came from Europe, right? They were trying to claim. And so their birthright citizenship takes off everywhere. The Uruguayans have a weird thing between nationality and citizenship, but we're not going to get into that. You can be a citizen, but not a national Uruguay. It's a really weird constitutional part they can't seem to get rid of. But every other place except for Colombia has birthright citizenship, right? I mean, this is really, Europe has gone the direction of mostly which has citizenship by blood primarily, but has really gone the direction now of almost every place finding ways that people that grew up in those countries can get citizenship, right? I mean, there's sort of a recognition, starting with Germany, which was sort of always the great example of jus sanguinis, right? Of legal, ties to blood being the way, if you were German, even though you grew up in Russia, when you came from a German descendant family, you could be German. But if you were from a Turkish family that lived there for 3 generations, you couldn't. They changed that in the early 2000s, right? I mean, most countries have moved the direction, at least in the industrial world, of finding ways of people getting citizenship if they grow up. The Dominican Republic went the other direction. And feel free to jump in, students, as well.
Dominic, I'm from Urban Studies.
Urban Studies, yay, okay, good.
But
Sorry, what was your name, by the way?
We're going to lunch.
We're going to lunch, great, okay.
I should warn you also about, I'm a historian as well.
Oh my God, so you actually.
So I'm gonna ask
yeah.
you a history question.
Oh, please do, yes,
but
which I'll probably fail at, but go ahead.
File under here.
I'm a public policy person, so nothing that happened more than 10 years ago ever happened.
No, so I teach a little bit about it in the class on migration and development, which is not.
Yeah.
About what I think you were referring to as somewhat older policies of diaspora relations, including with diasporas that vote and a lot of return migration and especially investment related policies. And you said a few brief things today. And, thank you for the wonderful talk. About how they're coming back. Yeah, that's right. Why? But I'm wondering what's new. Right? Why did they? But also. Why did many Latin American countries sort of lose interest in that or let that fall off to some extent in the last decade or so? Is there anything new in there?
Is there anything new? I think it's interesting because, countries have this fantasy that everyone left and their children and grandchildren will embrace, And by the way, when I was in Europe last week, my mother was from Denmark. I grew up I love the fact, actually, I told this to, I went to the University of Copenhagen, I was talking to scholars and, you know, I said, I'm actually grew up with the immigrant experience. It was the Danish club, the Nordic dance troupe, the Danish church. I mean, we had the whole, you know, I started working with Mexican hometown associations. It's when I first, like, I was, excuse me, this was like my growing up, actually, you know, I mean, you realize how much this is repeated across, you know, and I told them the story in part because it makes me Danish, right? I can actually say a few things in Danish, but I can't have a professional conversation, right? Like so many people are second generation, right? And for me, it's always both familiar and new. I mean, I love it deeply. I have family there. You know, I love hearing the language. The food is stuff I grew up with. You know, it's great. And at the same time, it is weird by the fact that it isn't as familiar as it should. Right? There's always that sort of weird distance that I realize I'm not. By the way, yeah, Gabriella can tell you about Copenhagen later. She spent you spent like 6 months there, 3 months there, right?
Months.
Yeah, okay. It's a whole other. Danes are interesting people. I think. Why do I tell you this? I tell you this because I think countries have this sort of desire to, they assume, you know, every Mexican is going to, you know, embrace their Mexicanness, you know, because they grew up, because they speak Spanish, they look Mexican, and they, you know, they can sing a couple, you know, Juan Gabriel songs. They're suddenly going to be like, you know, and their family do send remittances, by the way. They, you know, their families keep sending remittances year on year, and surprisingly, that actually does continue, sometimes in the second generation, that it's going to be a cure-all. And it turns out that governments really have never figured out what right? And so I think it goes in cycles because of that, because they keep thinking the diaspora is going to be their political influence in the United States or in Europe or wherever the diaspora is located. And yeah, but they got other priorities. They're not totally aligned with their, you know, country of origin. Even people who are first generation, right? They're still not totally, you know, you're Mexican. The Mexican government comes calling and they're like, we want you to be our lobby in the United States. They're like, wait, excuse me, it's Spanish. You know, I left because of you guys, right? You know, because you guys couldn't figure out our country, like, you know, or my parents left because, you know, they couldn't make a living here, and now you're coming and expecting me to be your life. So there's lots of complications in this relationship, right? I think where it works best is when countries figure out, and by the way, they can't figure out how to redirect resources, right? Because people send money, and yes, some people invest. I mean, one of my favorite, when I was doing the book on Mexico, Vanishing Frontiers, what I now need to rewrite. One of my favorite cases is a guy who runs a very large startup, very successful startup. And he actually put his back office in Mexico for his startup. He said himself, he's a beautiful office in downtown San Francisco. But, you know, the first time his friend, who was a white American, came to him and said, you know, I want to propose that we actually put the back office in Mexico, Guadalajara. It's like, that is the last place I would do. They, given the company has a name in Hindi, actually, because he always thought as an IT guy, he was like interested in, he was interested in Vietnam and India and other places. Like, no, Mexico was the place that my family left because, you know, we wanted to get out. You're telling me we should actually, there's like IT talent in Mexico. They ended up putting that company there. But it's a complicated relationship, right? And so it does happen, but it takes a lot of effort, you know, and governments think they can direct things and they think they can get some of the remittance money, and they usually can't. Right, at best, what they can do is facilitate transactions, for example, you know, help maybe give people loans, but which they use for personal reasons, right? They're going to use to start a company in their hometown, right? Or, you know, that's why I think it's so complicated. Governments come in with these big ideas and it never works. And then they get disenchanted, and the migrants get disenchanted, and their kids, because they're being asked to do things that we really, you know, they're really trying to use us here. And then they kind of rediscover each other. Right, because there is, I mean, look, I love going because again, it is part of who I am, right? I mean, people love keeping the connection with where they came from, right? You know, where their parents came from. So there is something there. And yet at the same time, you know, I'm sure some of you are immigrant or second generation, right? I mean, there is something there, but it isn't the only thing there, you know, so, you know.
I thought it was very interesting how you mentioned kind of the labor market kind of quickly and legally assimilating a bunch of workers in Latin America, especially in the contrast to kind of the like undocumented economy that like moves in the US. So could you maybe say a little bit more about this contrast and kind of how you see this moving in the future?
Yes and no. I mean, the legal, there was definitely an attempt in most countries to provide legal status. It worked better in some and than others. But actually Latin American and Caribbean countries have large informal markets, right? Which the US does too, right? I mean, one of the things, I always remember when you're in Europe, if you spent, anyone's from Europe or spent time in Europe, it's very hard for immigrants to enter the labor market. Right? I mean, not high level immigrants, right? Not people with lots of education. If you move there after, finishing your graduate work that you had, you'll be completely right. But for people who come on asylum or even people who came through, a work-based visa and they want to sort of move up, they're fairly inflexible labor markets that require lots of titling, especially in Northern Europe, right? I mean, that require lots of credentialing and all that sort of stuff. Fairly inflexible, really hard to live undocumented. We're actually doing a project in Europe right now. We have a Muslim Brussels. They're doing a project looking at the undocumented population. No one knows how big it is, right? And they've been trying to figure out sort of who's in this, and and it's different country to country, and who's, and these people who lost their asylum cases, never had visas, they overstayed visas. I mean, there's a bit of everything in this, right? As there is in the US. And by the way, there are people who are middle class and undocumented. I mean, lots of people actually who were successful over time and still undocumented. I mean, I was told, I know at least 2 people who were really successful and a lot wealthier than my wife and I are, who are undocumented, who started businesses, but they can't get papers. Well, one guy did actually for his daughter, which came, well, she has a green card now. The other guy can't, and yet. And so, I mean, those things don't always go hand in hand. But there's giant informal economies. And in some places, in Peru, for example, the Peruvian government is a disaster in general. I mean, in terms of sort of bureaucratic functioning. But you'll probably agree with me if that's the case. So they have trouble figuring out their legalization program. But the reality is also people in Peru, migrants themselves, look at this and go, I take a day off work and like go down and get my credential, and I have to go back again to pick it up, and this, that, and the other. Like, I'm never going to get a formal sector job anyway because the informal sector is so big. And a lot of people actually, I mean, they keep doing things that actually make a lot of sense that are fairly easy for people. That they started doing online processing. So you only had to go down once, and then you could pick up, you could download your permit once you were approved. You never had to go down again. People still didn't do it. And part of it is because the informal market, we think, I mean, we don't know, we have some colleagues who actually are on the ground who've been looking at this and in another organization, but we think it's been largely because, even taking a day off and having to pay, there is some money you have to pay. I mean, it's not worth it if you're never gonna get a formal job. So that said, I think it's interesting. I mean, Latin American, Caribbean countries are not terrible places to be, as someone starting their life over, in the sense that it's fairly easy access to labor markets. That said, they are not necessarily good places to be 20 years on. Same reasons, right? I mean, and this happens in the US as well, which is you can get trapped in, it's very easy to get a labor market, but you can get trapped in the low end of labor.
We're kind of running out of time, but since you've been in contact with makers, and I want to give you the chance to say what's going on in the US and what is it? Since you participate in this policy discussions here, and can you tell us something about what's going on?
Well, the last time I talked to Stephen Miller, I've never talked to Stephen Miller. Yeah, it's a really strange time. So where do we start? I mean, I think we have a government that has decided that won the election in part on pushing back against what they call legal immigration. By the way, I do occasionally use the term illegal immigration. I never use illegal immigrant, but I do use illegal immigration. Well, it's not our preferred term. We use unauthorized, which is the term. But that was their, legal immigration is their sort of wedge issue, and it worked for them, right? I think we would be mistaken to think that that was not influential, right? There is a majority of Americans who are concerned that the Biden administration lost control of immigration. And we're seeing this worldwide, by the way. I mean, there's been a surge. The numbers, we don't really have good numbers yet that support this globally, but you can certainly add up numbers from some of the traditional destination countries and see the number of people who come in through regular ways has grown, right, in the past 4 or 5 years. And so you see this in many places. And one of the things, I was hinting at this earlier with openness and closure, but one of the things we do say fairly frequently is, you know, it's not enough to have good policies. You also have to have public support for policies. Now, if it's not a salient issue, it doesn't matter as much. Like Latin American, it was really fun working with policymakers in Latin America because at the time they were trying to figure out some of the responses. It wasn't a salient issue, which meant they didn't care that much, right? They could do lots of really creative things. Then became public issue. They had to be more cautious. But, you know, generally speaking, once migration becomes a publicly salient issue, you need to make sure that you maintain public support. I'll give you a side example on this too, which is Canada is dealing with immigration as a public policy issue right now. There's a huge consensus in Canada that immigration is a good thing, but they kind of, well, the numbers increased. They allowed the numbers to increase what they call the levels over the past 3 or 4 years and kind of lost control of it. And then they lost control of making sure that all the students coming in were actually going to universities and not just going to work when they came in. And so they started discovering thousands of students that actually were never enrolled or were enrolled, but never actually went to a day of school. And so they began to lose the argument. So I think we always have to think about, we can dream up whatever policy you want, but policies also have to have an anchor. In democratic societies have to have an anchor in some sort of policy. That said, so I think there is a perception, I think they have correctly read the public that the public wants greater control and immigration. There is some support for deportations. So when you start asking people about deporting criminals, huge support. You start asking people about deporting people who've been here a long time and then support creators. Actually make a lot of distinctions. So, but the second part of this is, I think they've read part of public opinion right. And then I think there is a group that is highly influential, led by Stephen Miller, who really, if you haven't read Project 2025, read it. Read the opening part. Actually, the immigration part's not as useful as the other part because they're going much further than the immigration part. The immigration part's really radical, but read the beginnings of it. There's a really ideological world, and Europeans kept asking me last week, like I said, it's more like Orban than Meloni. You know, more like the Hungarian leader than the Italian leader, who's very pragmatic, kind of says things, throws a firebomb, but then sort of makes deals on the side. There's a very, I think Trump may be like Meloni, it's different temperament, but I think he's more pragmatic and less ideological and much more instinctive. But he has definitely empowered a group of people who are highly ideological and who see getting rid of people from third world, or people from third world countries, which is how they would describe it, as being in the interest of the United States. And there's lots of contradictions in this, right? Because, you know, Vivek Ramaswamy, like running for governor of Ohio, and Bernie Moreno was just elected, whose brother was the ambassador of Colombia, by the way, was just elected as senator. You can dissect this in all sorts of ways and go, okay, intellectual consistency here, and, you know, it sort of falls apart. But I think they really are in that mindset, and I think we are going to see a larger number of immigration and apprehensions. That said, remember the highest number of people that have been deported 1 year from the US is 250,000, a little under 250,000. End of Bush, beginning of Obama, last year. So maybe they doubled that, maybe they tripled that over time. But you know, there is due process for people who are apprehended and don't have an open return order. There is logistical complications of holding people and sending people back. So they're building a regime around this that is going to start to run into some actual complications. And I think is going to run into some complications in public opinion once it goes beyond people with criminal records or open. Or at least he says optimistic. Yes.
Okay, so we run out of time.
Yeah. Really positive.
Good, how are you? Did you finish? Presentation?